Okay, first lesson in our new unit, the nervous system. I had to build it backwards, so it takes me a little longer. But this unit, I love it. There's so much content. It's so interesting and really have to narrow down what to focus on. But I hope you love it as much as I do. And if you are not yet liked and subscribed to my channel, what are you waiting for? I promise you won't regret it. All right, so let's dive in. Let's see what we're learning about. So in topic 1, we're going to cover the introduction and the functions of the nervous system. So what is the nervous system? Well, it's a fast electrochemical communication network. So that means electrochemical signals are used, and it allows us to communicate with and react to the environment. So it allows us to respond to things that are happening inside and outside of our bodies. What are the functions of the nervous system? Well, primarily sensation. So that means using our senses to interpret things both inside again and outside of our bodies. Integration, so a lot of coordination, and then response. So how are we going to react? Is there going to be muscle movement? Is there going to be gland secretion? What is going to happen? What is the functional unit of the nervous system? It's a neuron. All right, so here's what a neuron looks like. One of the sort of interesting things I find about neurons is they're never actually touching. So you see those dendrites, those little tentacle-like things on one side, they're the receivers. They pick up all the signals, and then it travels through the cell body down the axon to the axon terminals. And then the axon terminal is going to get real close to the next dendrite. But it's like if your sibling ever went like, I'm not touching you, and having their finger or hand or whatever really close to you. That's how neurons are. They get so close, but they never, ever actually touch. What are the two main divisions of the nervous system? Well, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is further broken apart into the somatic. So that's what controls your skeletal muscles, your voluntary movement, also your reflexes. And then the autonomic nervous system. So that controls your glands, your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, involuntary stuff. And then the autonomic is further divided. Okay, and that's divided into the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight response, and it releases adrenaline, and then the parasympathetic response, which is rest and digest, and it involves the release of acetylcholine. And how is the brain protected? Well, it is actually protected really well. And in fact, the spinal cord has just as many layers of protection. So this is not exclusive to the brain. It's exclusive to the CNS, the central nervous system. So there's bone, your cranium or your vertebrae, meninges. That's 3 layers of connective tissue. The dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And then there is a blood-brain barrier, which limits what can get into the brain. And then there is the cerebrospinal fluid acting as like a cushion. And how is the brain divided? Well, it's divided into 2 hemispheres, right and left, and 4 lobes, temporal, occipital, parietal, and frontal. All right, so let's just look at some images. That's the central and peripheral nervous system, central, brain and spinal cord, peripheral, all the other nerves. There's the divisions of the nervous system. You can see CNS and PNS. CNS, brain, spinal cord. PNS, somatic, autonomic, and then autonomic, sympathetic, parasympathetic. And then here you can see the 2 hemispheres and 4 lobes of the brain. Now, all this information, we're going to go into much greater detail. This is just a lead-in, okay? So what part of the nervous system is responsible for rest and digest? Let's see, let's move me so maybe you could see it better. There we go. So what do you think? Do you know? It should be parasympathetic. And which of the following does not provide protection for the CNS? Do you know? Hopefully you do. It's just B, ribs. It does not protect the CNS, protects the heart and lungs. All right, so the next topic is neurons or nerve cells. So here is an image of a neuron. So what are neurons? They're nerve cells. They are the functional units of the nervous system, okay? What are the main parts of a neuron? So we have the dendrites, those are the receivers. We have the soma, that's another name for the cell body. We have the axon, that's the long part of the neuron, and it's going to carry the signal to the next neuron, and it may have a myelin sheath. Now, if it has a myelin sheath, it speeds up the connection. So you'll see on the top image, you can see there's a myelin sheath. It's that fatty layer wrapped around the outside, and then there's those little gaps. Those are the nodes of Ranvier. And what happens is a signal jumps to those nodes, which makes a signal able to transmit much faster because the whole neuron doesn't have to do the influx of positives and negatives, only in those little nodes. And then when it finally reaches the axon terminal, there are synaptic vesicles filled with neurotransmitters that cross the synapse and go to the next neuron. So what happens at the synapse? Neurotransmitters cross that space to bring the signal to the next neuron. What causes the nerve signal? Well, it's a pretty complicated process, but it's an action potential. So that means the charge across the membrane of the neuron changes. The inside of the cell is negative, and then when we have the depolarization, sodium or Na positive rushes into the cell when the nerve is signaled. Now, at first, this may be slow, and the nerve cell may not reach threshold. If it doesn't reach threshold, the nerve doesn't respond. But once threshold is reached, the Na channels open wide, and all of them open and let the depolarization happen. And then repolarization is the Na gates close and the potassium open, and the charge gets reestablished. Then the neuron has to reset for the next action potential. So here's the process. So you can see the inside is negative. You can see it at negative 70. You can see those failed initiations when not enough sodium came into the cell to reach threshold. You see that black line threshold? Those failed interactions didn't get to threshold. Once threshold is reached, sodium rushes in, depolarizing that neuron. You can see how all of a sudden it becomes way positive, right? And then in the repolarizing process, potassium is leaving, but the cell kind of overshoots that process, and you can see it goes way below where it was. But then the cell rebalances, moves everything back where it's supposed to be back in the resting state. And you can see this happens in milliseconds. So this is not minutes or even seconds, milliseconds. All right, so what part of a neuron receives the signals? Do you know what the receivers are? Right, it's the dendrites. What is the space between neurons called? Do you know this one? Yeah, it's the synapse. All right, so next is reflexes. So what is a reflex? It's an involuntary, meaning you don't think about it, it just happens, response to a stimulus. And how do reflexes happen? There's a reflex arc. It is a short pathway that allows a response before the signal is transmitted to the brain. Now, the signal does still go to the brain because you felt the hammer hit your knee. You felt touching the hot stove. But the signal does not have to go to the brain before you respond. Okay, so it goes from the sensory neuron to the spinal cord to an interneuron, back out on a motor neuron right away. But the signal is still going to the brain. And this one that you see the GIF for is the patellar reflex or the knee jerk reflex. So there are some other reflexes that we're going to talk about. Here are a few of them. So we have the Moro or the startle reflex. This is a good reason to swaddle babies. So you could see that one in the GIF. When a baby feels that it might be falling, and sometimes this happens when they're sleeping, the reflex just happens. They kind of startle their arms, they abduct really wide, and then the arms will come back in. But sometimes when they do that, they literally wake themselves up. So swaddling is a good thing. There's the rooting and sucking reflex, which are responsible for helping the baby find the nipple and to get nutrition. So the rooting reflex means the baby will turn toward which side the cheek is stroked, and the sucking reflex, when something touches the roof of the mouth, the infant will suck on it. And then there's palmar grasp, and plantar grasp is the same thing, but on the foot. And what are some of the reflex signs that can indicate nervous system issues? Well, there's Hoffman signs. So if you flick the middle finger and if you see flexion of the thumb and middle finger, it can indicate brain tumor, multiple sclerosis, spinal cord injury. Snout reflex is lips puckering when the upper lip is lightly tapped. That can indicate some frontal lobe damage. And this is normal in infants, but it should not happen in adults. And then there's the glabellar reflex. So if you didn't know, this part of your, like above the bridge of your nose, between your eyes, is called the glabella. Bet you didn't know that. Maybe you did. But when you tap that, it can cause blinking. For most people, including babies, it should stop after a few times. If it continues, so you are continuing to press the glabella, and the person continues to blink, that can be an indication of Parkinson's disease or possibly another brain abnormality. So let's look. A reflex allows a response after the signal reaches the brain. False! Before. And what reflex explains why it is helpful to swaddle babies? Do you remember? It's the Moro. It's the startle reflex. All right, so now the brain. How much does the brain weigh? It weighs about 3 pounds. What protects the brain? We talked about this already. Bone, the CSF or cerebrospinal fluid, the meninges, 3 layers, and the blood-brain barrier. What are the parts of the brainstem? We have the midbrain. That is the most superior. That is like responsible for some sensory integration. We have the pons, which is the next inferior, and it kind of bulges out. That is sleep, wake, and REM, which is rapid eye movement, so with dreaming. And the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest. It sits right on top of the spinal cord, and it's responsible for vital life functions like heart rate and breathing. Okay, if your medulla oblongata is damaged, you would not be able to survive. What is the limbic system responsible for? Emotions and memory. So there's the hypothalamus, responsible for homeostasis. There's the thalamus, and that's like a sensory relay. And then we have the hippocampus. That's responsible for memory storage and connection, so connecting your senses to memories. And then the amygdala is responsible for your intense emotions like fear and anger, for example. What is the cerebellum responsible for? Coordination, posture, and balance. That's the little one. It's little, like means little brain. It looks like a bell hanging on the inferior part of the brain. What is the cerebrum? It's the largest part of your brain. That's what's divided into 2 lobes and 4 hemispheres. What is the corpus callosum? That's that neural network that connects the 2 hemispheres. What are the 4 lobes of the brain? We have temporal, occipital, frontal, and parietal. And what are the differences between the left and right hemispheres? Well, the left is like logic, math, language. The right is art, creativity, more of a holistic approach. Okay, so I like this image as the left tends to be analytic, okay, lists, organized, and the right is more holistic, art, imagination, music, those kind of things. But it is not a perfect system. That is not 100% of all of the logic is on the left side. There is crossover. All right, so how much does the brain weigh? Do you remember? Right, about 3 pounds. And the human brain has how many of each? Do you remember? It's 4 lobes, 2 hemispheres. All right, so drugs and alcohol. So what is alcohol? Alcohol is ethyl alcohol or ethanol, and it's classified as a depressant. So how do we make it? The fermentation of yeast, sugar, and starches. It causes an increase in insulin secretion, which lowers blood sugar. It's also a diuretic, which causes your body to remove fluid, so you go to the bathroom more. So you can become dehydrated. So your blood sugar can drop and you can become dehydrated. How is the body affected by long-term or excessive alcohol use? Well, you can get chronic diseases like liver cirrhosis, pancreatitis, cancer of the liver, the mouth, the throat, can get high blood pressure, and psychological disorders. Also, the use of alcohol excessively is responsible for a lot of unintentional injuries like motor vehicle accidents, falls, drownings, burns. It also is responsible for some violence like the maltreatment of children, homicides, and suicides. So we're going to talk about a few main categories of drugs. They're depressants. They slow down the activity of the central nervous system. Things like alcohol, Xanax, Rohypnol. Rohypnol is the date rape drug. Your heart rate and respiration rate drop. It slows down messages between your senses, your body, and your brain. And then you have stimulants. They're kind of the opposite. So they're going to increase the activity. So it's going to boost mental alertness and are considered mood elevators. Things like nicotine, caffeine, cocaine, meth, Ritalin. The side effects, though, can be insomnia, loss of appetite, paranoia, among others. We have hallucinogens. They're drugs that can cause hallucinations. There's PCP and LSD. Those are kind of the main ones in that category. Side effects, though, are altered senses and memory loss. And they're narcotics or opioids. They're drugs that act as analgesics to numb pain. So heroin, opium, morphine, codeine. Side effects are poor judgment. It's why they tell you when you have surgery and you've had narcotics, do not sign contracts. Do not make major life decisions. But it also slows your heart rate. It can cause you to go into a coma, and it can impair your thinking. And there are other drugs that kind of don't fit so neatly into those categories, like marijuana, like ecstasy and Molly, that may fit into more than one of those categories. All right, so alcohol is considered which one? If you said depressant, you were right. And morphine would be which one? If you said narcotic, you got it. All right, so now let's talk about some disorders. So what's a headache? Literally pain in the head. There can be sinus headaches, cluster headaches, and tension headaches. What's a migraine? Well, a migraine is simply not a bad headache. A migraine can last hours to days or even longer. Usually it's on one side of the head, and it has other symptoms that accompany it besides pain, like nausea, sensitivity to light and sound. What is a concussion? That's a traumatic injury to the brain from violent shaking, spinning, or trauma. So it can be from a sports injury. And what is amnesia? Amnesia is the inability to remember events for a period of time. So it could be to illness, brain injury, or even alcohol and drug use. So not remembering what happened while you were under the influence. And what happens if the corpus callosum is damaged? Well, signals can't cross between the hemispheres, and certainly not as effectively, so it can affect speech and coordination. There were some studies done in like the 1940s and 50s, the split brain studies. However, it's been shown that those are not reproducible, so there's a lot of questions about the validity of those. But there is an interesting thing called the alien or left hand syndrome that occurs when people have the corpus callosum damaged, where the left hand appears to do things without the person's knowledge, or even that they're acting to make it move. So pick up something or open a door or scratch the face, and it is not under their control. What is Parkinson's disease? Well, it's a progressive disorder and it affects movement. So a major sign is tremors, and remember that glabellar, that Meyerson sign, the glabellar reflex. What is Alzheimer's disease? It's a progressive disorder. It's the most common cause of dementia. And what is a stroke? That's an interruption in blood supply to the brain. Okay, so here's just a quick image that shows what happened in the split brain studies, where things were tested about whether or not people could see the word and what object they would pick up, and based on which side it was shown to, there were different results. All right, so this question, a migraine is just a bad headache? False. And what causes an interruption to the blood supply to the brain? And that would be a stroke. And there you have it. There's an overview of the nervous system and introduction to those 6 topics. Hopefully you learned something and found it interesting. Again, like and subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.